Recently, something happened in the United States that has left many people around the world stunned, not just because of its scale, but because it closely mirrors a prophecy made long ago by Edgar Cayce. For years, Cayce spoke of signs that would appear before a great spiritual turning point. Today, as this prophecy appears to align with real-world events, people wonder, was this a sign from God? And if so, what does it mean for our time? As global tension rises, faith is tested, and moral boundaries continue to blur, many are beginning to wonder whether these are the very conditions. Cayce warned about conditions that would precede the return of Christ. Is what just happened in the USA a divine signal, a final call to reflection, repentance, and spiritual readiness? A leader will rise. When Edgar Cayce spoke about the future, he painted a picture of a long, painful period. He called the tribulations, a time when America would be pushed to its breaking point. In his readings, he described a country turning against itself, coastal regions dealing with disasters no one had ever seen before, and an economy that would collapse, rebuild, and reshape the nation in ways people could hardly imagine. And throughout his work, 2 years kept appearing again and again. 2025 and 2026, the years he believed would mark America's greatest trial. One of Cayce's readings, number 3976-15, from 1934, spoke of enormous changes within the earth itself. He explained that these shifts would start slowly, almost quietly, before speeding up at a pace no one could ignore. He mentioned signs appearing in the South Pacific, the Mediterranean, and especially along the American coasts, places where the ground would break, waters would rise, and normal life would be disrupted. What made this even more unsettling was that Cayce linked these earth changes directly to moments of testing for those in power, suggesting that leaders would be forced into decisions they were not prepared to make. A few years later, in 1939, Cayce was asked about the future of American democracy, and his answer was even more alarming. In reading 1152-111, he warned that the greatest danger to democracy would not come from foreign enemies, but from within its own house. He said the internal division would reach its peak when the man of commerce holds the highest office, and this leader, he said, would be pushed into a defining moment where he would have to choose between siding with powerful financial interests or standing with the people. Cayce hinted that this choice could determine whether democracy survives or collapses. When you picture a businessman president being forced to choose between economic elites and ordinary citizens, the parallels become hard to ignore. Cayce also returned again and again to the idea of earth changes during this period. He predicted massive seismic activity in 2025 and 2026, especially along the Pacific coast and in regions long believed to be stable. These disasters, he said, would challenge the government's ability to act fairly and wisely. The leader in power would have to decide whether to take harsh, authoritarian measures to maintain control or allow freedom to remain intact, even if it meant facing greater chaos. According to Cayce, this moment would reveal what the leader truly stood for. This is where Cayce's warnings begin to connect with the figure he described as the businessman leader, a man whose decisions would shape the nation's fate during this intense period. In another reading, 270-35, from 1936, Cayce became even more specific. He said the mid-2020s would bring a moment when the destroyer becomes the builder, or the builder becomes the destroyer. It was his way of explaining that the American leader would reach a crossroads. Either take a path that heals the nation and rebuilds what has been damaged, or choose a path that deepens division and pushes the country toward greater conflict. This turning point, Cayce said, would follow a great shaking, both physically within the earth and politically within the halls of power. According to him, the real test would not be a single crisis, but the choices made by the person leading the nation when those crises converge. After a collapse, Cayce saw a leader born not from comfort or privilege, but from trial and hardship, someone whose authority would come from scars healed into wisdom rather than from trophies polished for show. He called her the woman of light, and his portrait of her is quietly radical. She carries the wounds of her people as a crown. She knows sorrow intimately and lets that sorrow teach her. And she knows division so that she can answer it with empathy rather than rhetoric. Cayce told us that the new leader is not a ruler in the old sense, staking claim to power and commanding obedience, but a restorer who patches what has been torn. Her tools are not swords or decrees, but patience, listening, and a steadiness of purpose that draws others toward repair. Where the age of kings was measured in pomp and spectacle, the age she ushers in is measured by kinship. This is leadership that emerges from the life of a community, rather than being imposed from the top down. Cayce said, "When the land grows most weary, and hope seems but an ember in the ashes, look not to the thunder, but to the quiet flame." That quiet flame, he implies, will not be found in dramatic entrances or viral moments, but in the small, steady acts that restore confidence. The teacher who refuses to give up on a class, the community organizer who sits in a room until people begin to trust one another again, the nurse who shows up for a forgotten patient. These are not glamorous scenes, but they are the crucible in which genuine renewal is forged. Cayce called the time after her rise the age of renewal. When the mender takes her place, he said, the shadow that cloaked the land shall begin to lift, and that lifting is best imagined not as a dramatic moment, but as a slow dawn, people waking from a long, exhausted sleep with clearer eyes, beginning to look at one another not as threats, but as reflections of the same hopes and wounds. In that change, the simple acts of seeing and listening become revolutionary. What makes Cayce's 2026 prediction so striking isn't just the accuracy of his past readings, it's the depth and consistency of his message. Statistical analyses of his thousands of recorded sessions show that too many of his forecasts proved correct for them to be dismissed as mere coincidence. So, when he made specific remarks about America in the 2022, researchers began paying closer attention. And among all those readings, the one tied to 2026 stands out as one of his most detailed and symbolically rich. In a 1938 session, recorded as reading 602-3, Cayce was asked about the future of democracy. His response was both prophetic and unsettling. He said that America would face a crucial crossroads in the mid-2022, a time when the nation would have to decide whether to move forward with a higher, more awakened consciousness or slide backward into old cycles of control and division. What caught many scholars' attention was his repeated reference to the number 26, a number that appears again and again in his writings about the United States. It wasn't a random figure. Cayce used numbers as symbolic anchors, and 26 seemed to represent a moment of testing, a turning point in which the soul of a nation would be revealed. Cayce often spoke in symbols and metaphors, but his stenographers recorded his words carefully. He talked about cycles of leadership, karma, and return. Cayce explained that certain souls, what he called returning souls of leadership, come back across lifetimes to finish the work they once began. These individuals, he said, often appear during periods of upheaval. They are divisive figures, both admired and condemned, because their purpose is to bring hidden truths to the surface. In one reading, Cayce said that America's greatest trials would be tied to one of these returning souls, someone who had once held great power, lost it, and returned again to face his unfinished destiny. When we compare that to Donald Trump's political journey, the meteoric rise, the dramatic fall, and his determined re-emergence, it's difficult not to see the parallels. He didn't just talk about personal karma, he warned about national karma. As a man sows, so must a nation reap, he said. In his view, entire civilizations, like individuals, go through cycles of learning, decline, and renewal. America, he believed, was entering its own period of reckoning, a time when greed, corruption, and moral decay would come face to face with the consequences of their own making. Just as ancient empires had fallen when they strayed too far from spiritual truth, Cayce suggested that modern America would reach a similar point of reflection. To him, 2026 wasn't just a date, it was a mirror year, one that would reveal whether the nation could rise to a higher consciousness or collapse under the weight of its unlearned lessons. And at the heart of that mirror, he hinted, would stand a returning soul, one whose rise and trials would symbolize the deeper struggle within America itself. Among his most haunting prophecies was one he gave near the end of his life, a vision of a massive storm forming over the Atlantic Ocean, stretching across the eastern coast of the United States. He called it not just a storm of nature, but a storm within the hearts of men. According to Cayce, this storm represented both a literal and spiritual reckoning. He said that during this time, a leader tied to towers and gold would rise to face the chaos. At first, he would stand firm, confident in his own strength, believing he could control the forces around him. But soon, he would come to realize that this storm was far greater than him, that it was not something any man could command. We see in it a reflection of our modern times, particularly the turbulence building around the year 2026, a period that seems to carry the weight of political unrest, spiritual awakening, and environmental upheaval all at once. And yes, many believe this prophecy aligns directly with the figure of Donald Trump, the man whose name has become almost synonymous with wealth, towers, and gold. Cayce's storm wasn't just about politics or the weather, it was about the human. He said that truth would no longer belong only to the powerful, that technology, the internet, and the collective voice of ordinary people would begin to expose what was hidden. In his words, this awakening would divide humanity into two paths, those who cling to fear and those who seek understanding. He warned that this coming crisis, the one symbolized by the storm, would test not just governments, but human consciousness itself. It would ask every individual and every leader to choose what they truly serve, ego or spirit, greed or grace. Cayce said that every collapse carries within it the seed of renewal, that destruction is not the end, but the doorway to revelation. The storm, in his view, was not a punishment, but a cleansing, a force meant to awaken humanity to something higher. In his later readings, Cayce spoke not of one man who would save the world, but of a collective awakening, what he called the Christ consciousness. He described it as a divine force that would rise within ordinary people during moments of despair. Not a single savior descending from the heavens, but millions of souls, choosing love over division, compassion over control. When asked when this would begin, Cayce answered, "When there is turmoil in the land of the free and confusion in the hearts of its people." Look around today at the unrest, the anger, the deep divisions tearing at the soul of America, and it's hard not to wonder if this is exactly what Cayce was talking about. He said this awakening would test every leader, especially those with the builder archetype, those who create empires, shape nations, and stand as symbols of worldly power. For such figures, the storm would not just shake their surroundings, but expose the truth of what they serve, revelation to the world. Edgar Cayce didn't just casually mention 2026. He saw it long before anyone could even imagine why that year mattered. And to understand why he was so shaken, we have to go back to one particular winter morning that changed everything for him. It was a cold December morning in 1943, when the people closest to him began to realize something was different. Cayce, the man who had given more than 14,000 psychic readings, with a calm confidence that reassured even the most doubtful minds, suddenly carried a heaviness in his eyes that no one could explain. For decades, he had helped people find answers through visions that came to him only in deep trance states. He diagnosed illnesses doctors couldn't identify, guided families to missing loved ones, and uncovered forgotten pieces of history with an accuracy that baffled experts. But something in him shifted that December, and the people around him felt it instantly. His longtime secretary, Gladys Davis, later revealed in a diary, one that no one saw until many years after his death, that Cayce had woken from a trance that day, screaming. She wrote that his body was shaking uncontrollably, cold sweat covering his forehead, and when she tried to understand what he had seen, he simply whispered, "Gladys, I saw the moment when everything changes, and it's sooner than we thought." Those were not the words of a man exaggerating or seeking attention. Those were the words of someone who had just witnessed something he wished he hadn't. As the winter of 1944 arrived, these spontaneous visions became more frequent. This was unusual for Cayce because his insights normally required him to enter a self-induced trance. But now the visions came without warning, crashing into his awareness like waves breaking violently along a shore. And one of those visions was so powerful that he described it to his family again and again, as if it had been burned into his mind. He said he saw the Earth suspended in space, but what shook him wasn't the planet itself, it was the light approaching it. It wasn't the sun, and it wasn't the moon. It was something entirely foreign, a kind of light he had no words for. When this light touched the Earth, he said he saw people awakening, not figuratively, but literally, as though a spiritual sleep that had lasted thousands of years suddenly ended. The image frightened him so deeply that he kept returning to it in conversations during his final months. But the most unsettling part wasn't the light or the awakening. It was the date that kept appearing in his visions, 2026. And here is where things become even harder to dismiss as mere coincidence. Cayce died in January 1945, exactly 81 years before 2026. Before he passed, he had predicted that his life would end when his mission on Earth was complete, and his final reading was about himself. In that reading, he said something that now feels strangely prophetic. "My work here will end when the seed of the great change is planted." 19:1 Basque. This raised a question that many people have wrestled with ever since. How could a man living in the 1940s be so certain about a year, nearly a century away? And why did 2026 become the central focus of his final months? As people discovered the Edgar Cayce Association archives, they found a personal letter he wrote to a close friend just 3 weeks before he passed away. In the letter, he said, "My dear friend, the visions about 2026 have become so clear and insistent that I can no longer ignore them. I saw that in that year, humanity will receive a kind of upgrade in its perception capacity. It won't be evolution. It will be activation, as if a dormant code in our DNA were suddenly turned on by a signal coming from the cosmos." He went on to explain that those who had prepared themselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually would experience a dramatic expansion of consciousness, something so profound that it would feel like being born again. But those who resisted the change, out of fear or stubborn skepticism, would find the coming years increasingly disorienting. Cayce described it almost like people trying to breathe in an atmosphere that no longer matched their inner state. What fascinated me even more was how consistently he connected these coming changes with events happening beyond our planet. He kept referring to a kind of approach, something moving toward us from space, something he believed would directly influence human consciousness. And here's where modern science enters the picture in a way that feels almost uncanny. Today, researchers confirm that our solar system is moving through a region of the galaxy with different energetic properties. Some scientists even suggest that shifts in this cosmic environment could influence human biology, including our neurological processes. Cayce seemed to describe this very phenomenon decades before anyone talked about it publicly. He said he saw energy waves coming from the center of the galaxy, waves that would reach Earth in 2026 and activate parts of the human brain that had been dormant for millennia. He insisted these waves wouldn't be visible, nor measurable with current instruments, but their impact would be unmistakable. "It will be as if all of humanity receives a message simultaneously," he explained, "not a message made of words, but of understanding. And those capable of receiving it would unlock abilities they never imagined were possible." If Cayce was right, and honestly, the more I study his predictions, the harder it becomes to dismiss them. Then 2026 isn't just another year. It's the moment where everything we think we know about human reality will be challenged. For Cayce, the question was never if these changes would happen. The real question was, will you be ready for them? He didn't leave people without guidance. Cayce spoke repeatedly about how those living through this transition should prepare. Meditation, for example, wasn't something he viewed as strictly spiritual. It was a form of training, a way to expand the mind's capacity to receive new information. He encouraged people to develop their intuition and to learn how to trust their inner voice. But more than anything, he emphasized maintaining an open mind and a compassionate heart, warning that judgment and rigid thinking would create resistance that could block a person from participating in the coming transformation. And then there was one final revelation, one he never shared publicly during his lifetime. According to notes discovered decades later, Cayce confided only to his wife, Gertrude, that 2026 wouldn't mark just the awakening of humanity. It would also mark the return of something, or someone, that had been absent from Earth for a long time. He spoke of teachers returning, beings of extraordinary consciousness who had once walked among ancient civilizations. Cayce said they would return quietly, not as saviors or religious icons, but as gentle guides, influencing those who were ready to awaken. "They will be among us again," he whispered in his final days, "but only those with eyes to see will recognize them." The most haunting part of all this comes from Cayce's last recorded words about his visions of 2026. His secretary, Gladys Davis, documented them on January 3, 1945, just 2 days before he died. He said, "The year 2026 will be remembered as the moment when humanity stopped being merely human, not through technology or evolution, but through awakening to who we really are and always have been. Those who embrace this truth will discover they are capable of much more than they ever dreamed. Those who reject it will remain trapped in a reality that no longer exists." And now here we are, standing only a short distance away from the year that consumed the final months of the greatest modern seer's life. You might think this is just another dramatic theory, another prediction that will fade like so many others. But what if it doesn't? What if Cayce really saw something we haven't fully understood yet? What if the changes he described are already happening, quietly reshaping our world in ways we're just beginning to notice? Because if you're honest with yourself, you can feel it, can't you? That strange sense that the world is shifting, that we're approaching something big, something that feels both overwhelming and strangely familiar. Maybe that feeling is exactly what Cayce was trying to warn us about. Maybe it's the first sign that the awakening he described has already begun. Warning for the end times. Cayce's warnings reached beyond cracked asphalt and collapsing piers. He described a collapse of faith that would accompany any great geological rupture, a period when hope itself would feel as unstable as the ground beneath people's feet. In his view, the shaking of the earth and the shaking of human trust were two expressions of the same fracture. Physical destruction would expose spiritual fractures, and as towns and systems failed, many hearts would falter, leaving people confused, fearful, and profoundly isolated. Those who listened to Cayce heard more than imagery of broken roads. They heard a diagnosis of a society at risk of moral exhaustion. He pointed to small quakes, unusual subterranean movements, and accelerating environmental signs as early warnings, symptoms that, in his vision, would precede a far larger rupture. Once the first great break began in the South, he taught, the process would not stop. Stress would cascade along linked fault lines, and the resulting chaos would overwhelm ordinary mechanisms of comfort and control. Without warning systems that functioned or institutions capable of quick, humane responses, despair could spread as quickly as the water. What Cayce really wanted to say is when familiar places are lost, the social and spiritual scaffolding people rely on can dissolve with them. He imagined families uprooted in an instant, communities separated by new waterways, and entire neighborhoods rendered memory-scarred islands of loss. The sea he described did not arrive as a gentle tide, but as a rushing, violent force that erased the border between land and life, leaving survivors to grapple with grief, disorientation, and the difficult work of meaning-making. The consequences he sketched extended well beyond immediate suffering. Economic systems would falter, supply chains would break, and lines of communication that tie a functioning society together could be severed. Ports and highways, financial centers, and hubs of governance would face paralysis, and with that paralysis would come cascading shortages, insecure shelter, and the collapse of routine medical and social services. In such a scenario, fear would not be an abstract emotion but a practical threat to survival, and spiritual resilience would become as vital as food, water, and shelter. Yet Cayce framed this bleak prospect with a purpose. The catastrophe was also a test, an opportunity for renewal. He insisted that the collapse of institutions could be the crucible that forces people to confront priorities, abandon selfish systems, and rebuild toward humility and community. In his vision, the spiritual reckoning called for more than prayer. It required solidarity, the revival of neighborly bonds, and a reorientation away from materialism and toward values that sustain collective life. This emphasis on moral recovery shaped the practical implications Cayce offered. Preparation, he argued, had to work on two levels simultaneously: tangible readiness through supplies, safe locations, and community planning, and inward readiness through faith, humility, and a willingness to serve others. The two strands, physical and spiritual, reinforce each other. Communities with strong networks of mutual aid and shared moral purpose are more likely to withstand shock, coordinate relief, and preserve hope when infrastructure falters. One quatrain speaks chillingly of a double-headed empire breaking at dawn and the return of an exile during a burning summer. Interpreters read the double-headed empire as a nation split into opposing centers of power, two rival authorities, two competing narratives, each claiming legitimacy, while the burning summer becomes shorthand for a season of mass protest, civil unrest, or even climate-driven disaster that inflames existing divisions. Seen together, these images suggest not just temporary disorder, but structural fracture, a polity that no longer functions as a single, coherent whole. Nostradamus's scattered verses also contain images that many link to the modern-day United States, a land across the Great Sea, a new world, bathed in iron and fire, and a golden tower trembling beneath an eagle's shadow. These are poetic lines, but prophecy watchers treat symbols as signposts. The man of gold emerges repeatedly as a central figure, a leader enveloped in wealth, spectacle, and influence, a fast-rising celebrity politician who polarizes the public and accelerates division. In the contemporary frame, that description resonates strongly with a public figure associated with literal golden towers, vast personal fortune, and a media presence that mobilizes millions. The symbolism of the eagle often used for America. That image captures a nation that is outwardly powerful, yet inwardly disoriented. When an eagle falters, the ripple effects go beyond borders. A shaken U.S. projects instability globally, magnifying conflicts, unsettling alliances, and giving rise to opportunistic actors on the world stage. Thus, a domestic fracture becomes an international problem rather than a local crisis. The man of gold and the wounded eagle are not only political metaphors, they speak to identity and moral condition. When a nation's symbol is wounded, questions arise about collective purpose and conscience. When a leader becomes the focal point of both worship and revulsion, societal soul-searching begins. Ultimately, the divided nation portrait is both a warning and a call. It warns that a polarized polity, combined with dramatic leadership resurgence, can ignite broader instability, potentially reshaping not just domestic life, but the global order. It calls for sober reflection, reinforcing institutions, rebuilding civic trust, and renewing moral clarity, so that, should a storm come, the country responds with resilience rather than rupture. We're living in an age where we will see the fulfillment of the remaining one-third of his prophecies. Nostradamus saw all of these things happening, and this is what he wanted to warn us: that we were heading down into a terrible time that could destroy the world. Before doomsday arrives, it always brings us many signs. One of the clearest signs is the devastating destruction that impacts humanity. Nostradamus once warned us all about the eruption of a great fire. One quatrain describes fire in the New World and waves that drown, which has been interpreted as warnings of devastating wildfires and tsunamis. And when we looked back, the reality. You see, the devastating wildfires in Los Angeles, it's hard not to believe that the prophecy seems to have come true. The disaster has claimed at least 11 lives and destroyed tens of thousands of structures, including multi-million-dollar mansions, and the damages continue to escalate. In addition to the loss of lives and property, this catastrophic wildfire has exacerbated the housing insurance crisis for affected residents. This is the nightmare the United States has been confronting in recent times. As we face these predictions, it is essential to approach them with a balance of curiosity and caution, acknowledging both their historical context and their potential relevance to today's global challenges. It is also said that Nostradamus mentions lands turning into deserts and submerged cities, which many associate with the effects of climate change in regions like Brazil, where severe droughts could occur, and coastal areas in Asia and southern Europe, which could be at risk of flooding. These interpretations reflect current concerns about global warming and how it might reshape the world in the coming decades. To describe this verse, it can be understood that the already harsh climate situation will get worse. The French prophet predicts that extreme weather phenomena such as record heat, forest fires, droughts, and storms will increasingly occur with greater frequency and intensity. Global warming is a huge phenomenon in the modern day. The Bible does not specifically talk about climate change or global warming. However, the Bible does tell us the world will eventually be burned in fire, which could be another way to understand how alarming the Earth's condition will gradually become. Nostradamus describes earthquakes, floods, and storms that will surpass anything humanity has ever experienced before, suggesting that the world is on the brink of an unprecedented environmental crisis. Scholars of Nostradamus have pointed out that his predictions of natural disasters often align with current weather patterns, making this prophecy even more unsettling in a world where climate change is already wreaking havoc. The idea that even more severe natural disasters are looming no longer seems far-fetched. Scientists have repeatedly warned that events like global warming, deforestation, and pollution are exacerbating the frequency and intensity of natural disasters, and Nostradamus's prophecy seems to reflect these contemporary concerns. One of the most common interpretations of this prophecy is that Nostradamus was warning about the cumulative effects of climate change. References to fire in the sky and overflowing rivers could be interpreted as allusions to wildfires and extreme storms, both phenomena that are already occurring more frequently due to climate change. Additionally, the mention of the earth shaking may refer to an increase in seismic activity, something that some experts believe could be related to the extraction of natural resources and other human activities that affect soil stability. It is important to note that while Nostradamus's prophecies are often interpreted symbolically, the connection between his visions and current natural disasters has led to renewed interest in his writings. Some believe that the natural disasters predicted for 2025 will serve as a wake-up call for humanity, a warning that we must change our behavior before it is too late. On the other hand, skeptics argue that Nostradamus's predictions are too vague and can be interpreted in many different ways. 2 Peter 3:10 informs us, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare." God will one day erase this current universe and replace it with the new heavens and new earth. How much effort should be made saving a planet that God is eventually going to obliterate and replace with a planet so amazing and wonderful that the current Earth pales in comparison? In a world gripped by uncertainty and unrest, the prophecies of Nostradamus have captivated believers and skeptics alike for centuries. the occurrence of the third and fourth earthquake and hailstorm. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. Within the hour, the two witnesses are raptured. A third great earthquake destroys a tenth of Jerusalem. 7,000 people are killed, and those left alive are terrified and give glory to the God of heaven. Could these glorifiers of God be the Jews Jesus warns to flee when they see the abomination of desolation in the temple? Revelation 11:15-1-9 immediately takes us back to heaven, where we see Jesus beginning to reign on earth. 24 elders surround the throne, saying, "Jesus reigns, and it's time to reward his bondservants and those who fear his name, and to destroy those who destroy the earth." The temple of God in heaven is opened, and the Ark of the Covenant appears in his temple, and there is a fourth earthquake and a great hailstorm. At that moment, the day has come. Edgar Cayce foretold a moment when the earth beneath our feet would tear open, when the Pacific would roar inland and swallow cities that once defined the American dream. California, the land of sunshine, stars, and endless opportunity, would become the epicenter of a transformation so violent that the map of the United States would never look the same again. He spoke not of slow erosion or gentle shifts, but of sudden upheaval, waves rising where neighborhoods stand today, and millions watching everything they know pulled beneath the ocean. For decades, people laughed. They said the idea was impossible. Yet now, with the ground trembling more often, oceans rising faster than ever, and fault lines grinding beneath silent pressure, many have begun to wonder, what if the future he saw is already unfolding? Stay with us, because what Edgar Cayce predicted for California might be closer to reality than anyone ever imagined, and what he revealed will shock you. The wrath is coming in California. Among Cayce's prophecies, none was more vivid than his vision for California. He described a sudden, catastrophic sequence in which the ground would gape open and the Pacific would surge inland, swallowing neighborhoods and rewriting coastlines. He sketched a cataclysmic process, a violent quake beginning in Southern California, followed by a cascading sequence of ruptures that marched northward like falling dominoes until entire regions no longer resembled the maps people had memorized. He described this upheaval not merely as geological movement, but as a social and spiritual rupture, an event that would test faith, shatter systems, and force communities to confront what mattered most. The imagery he used, buildings tilting, highways snapping, water lines and power grids collapsing within minutes, paints a picture of immediate chaos and long-term transformation, where everyday life is interrupted so completely that recovery becomes a spiritual as well as a practical endeavor. Cayce positioned the beginning in the South, pointing to a stretch of land from San Diego through Los Angeles as the first to suffer. In his visions, the shock is not localized. Instead, a primary rupture transfers stress along interconnected faults, setting off secondary breaks that accelerate the devastation. This domino model is crucial to understanding the scope he described. Damage in one region would not be an isolated catastrophe, but the trigger for a systemic breakdown that could affect supply lines, communications, and governance across the western seaboard. Cayce offered the idea of deep, prolonged shaking long enough to break open the earth, the failure of essential infrastructure within minutes, and the northward propagation of pressure. It is the kind of description that turns abstract geological risk into scenes the mind can't easily forget. Families trapped where streets once ran, emergency centers cut off from the rest of the world, entire neighborhoods rendered islands of rubble and water. Cayce warned us, if water lines, power grids, and communications fail across a wide region, the domino effect reaches into the economy, healthcare, and national security. Ports go dark, supply chains stutter, and critical services become impossible to coordinate. Millions displaced by sudden inundation would require a large-scale humanitarian response, while the loss of major urban centers would force the nation to adapt to a wholly altered geography. Warning of spiritual collapse, Cayce's warnings reached beyond cracked asphalt and collapsing piers. He described a collapse of faith that would accompany any great geological rupture, a period when hope itself would feel as unstable as the ground beneath people's feet. In his view, the shaking of the earth and the shaking of human trust were two expressions of the same fracture. Physical destruction would expose spiritual fractures, and as towns and systems failed, many hearts would falter, leaving people confused, fearful, and profoundly isolated. Those who listened to Cayce heard more than imagery of broken roads. They heard a diagnosis of a society at risk of moral exhaustion. He pointed to small quakes, unusual subterranean movements, and accelerating environmental signs as early warnings, symptoms that, in his vision, would precede a far larger rupture. Once the first great break began in the South, he taught, the process would not stop. Stress would cascade along linked fault lines, and the resulting chaos would overwhelm ordinary mechanisms of comfort and control. Without warning systems that functioned or institutions capable of quick, humane responses, despair could spread as quickly as the water. What Cayce really wanted to say is when familiar places are lost, the social and spiritual scaffolding people rely on can dissolve with them. He imagined families uprooted in an instant, communities separated by new waterways, and entire neighborhoods rendered memory-scarred islands of loss. The sea, he described, did not arrive as a gentle tide, but as a rushing, violent force that erased the border between land and life, leaving survivors to grapple with grief, disorientation, and the difficult work of meaning-making. The consequences he sketched extended well beyond immediate suffering. Economic systems would falter, supply chains would break, and lines of communication that tie a functioning society together could be severed. Ports and highways, financial centers, and hubs of governance would face paralysis, and with that paralysis would come cascading shortages, insecure shelter, and the collapse of routine medical and social services. In such a scenario, fear would not be an abstract emotion, but a practical threat to survival, and spiritual resilience would become as vital as food, water, and shelter. Yet Cayce framed this bleak prospect with a purpose. The catastrophe was also a test, an opportunity for renewal. He insisted that the collapse of institutions could be the crucible that forces people to confront priorities, abandon selfish systems, and rebuild toward humility and community. In his vision, the spiritual reckoning called for more than prayer. It required solidarity, the revival of neighborly bonds, and a reorientation away from materialism and toward values that sustain collective life. This emphasis on moral recovery shaped the practical implications Cayce offered. Preparation, he argued, had to work on two levels simultaneously: tangible readiness through supplies, safe locations, and community planning, and inward readiness through faith, humility, and a willingness to serve others. The two strands, physical and spiritual, reinforce each other. Communities with strong networks of mutual aid and shared moral purpose are more likely to withstand shock, coordinate relief, and preserve hope when infrastructure falters. New tectonic plates are formed. A new map, Cayce insisted, would emerge from the chaos, one so altered that familiar coastlines and state borders would be difficult to recognize. In his visions, the Pacific pushed inward, turning swaths of interior west into coastal plains. Parts of Nevada, Arizona, and even Colorado became edged by water where desert once ruled, and entire regions that had been anchors of American life were shown as submerged memory. This was not described as gradual erosion or the incremental rise of tides, but as a wholesale remaking of geography. Cayce framed that new geography not as random loss, but as a form of cleansing, a purifying reset in which the earth itself responds to deeper human choices. He placed the transformation in moral terms: greed, ego, and spiritual neglect build pressure beneath the surface as surely as tectonic stress builds along fault lines, and when the thresholds are crossed, the result is both material calamity and symbolic rebuke. In his telling, the map's redrawn edges are a visible consequence of priorities gone wrong. The drowned neighborhoods and altered states are evidence that physical systems and human systems are intimately connected. San Francisco and Los Angeles are named not as distant icons, but as concrete examples of what could be lost. He imagined San Francisco's hills and bridges succumbing to violent earthquakes, whole blocks sliding into the sea, while Los Angeles would, in his account, cleave away from the mainland like a piece of coastline breaking off. Modern scientific work on tectonics and sea-level scenarios adds an unnerving echo to Cayce's portrait. Geologists have long mapped fault systems and modeled how a sufficiently large quake could trigger tsunamis, local subsidence, or rapid coastline change. Climate scientists produce simulations of shoreline retreat under extreme sea level rise. Emergency planners overlay population and infrastructure maps to reveal where damage would be worst. Yet Cayce's vision differs from scientific projection in one crucial respect. He saw the transformation as sudden and morally freighted, rather than gradual and mechanistic. Where scientists measure rates and probabilities, Cayce emphasized rupture and reckoning, an abrupt crossing of thresholds followed by societal as well as geographic collapse. That distinction matters because it changes the implications for preparation and response. A slowly changing coast invites mitigation and adaptation, whereas a sudden remapping demands resilience at every level. From emergency logistics to the spiritual resources communities rely on to endure loss. The picture he painted forces us to consider both the technical realities of fault lines and flooding and the deeper cultural choices that determine how well any nation weathers a truly transformative event. The anger from Nature Mother. Edgar Cayce made impressive predictions about changes in the Earth's geography. He claimed that the continents would shift and the climate would change the world in unimaginable ways. He suggested that this transformation could happen suddenly with the eruptions of Mount Etna in Italy and Mount Pelée in Martinique. Both are active volcanoes, with Etna being one of the most active in the world, having erupted recently, while Pelée had its last major eruption in 1902. One of the most critical aspects of this change would occur in Africa. Cayce predicted that the continent would split into 3 parts due to the formation of a massive new waterway, with the Nile River widening and the Red Sea expanding significantly. This dramatic change could even submerge the bustling city of Cairo under the sea. Asia would not escape these convulsions either. Cayce predicted changes in the geography of India, China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. He stated that the Pacific Ocean would advance and swallow large portions of land from the Philippines to Japan, leaving only a few remaining islands. The Korean peninsula and parts of China's coastline would also succumb to the rising seas. For India, Cayce issued a specific warning. He advised seeking refuge in the country's higher elevations due to the potential collapse of land. He believed that the Himalayas in Tibet and Nepal would offer safer refuge for Indians. Cayce also made less favorable predictions for Antarctica. He suggested that as the ice melted, the geological structure of the region would undergo drastic transformations, affecting global climate and altering weather patterns in unpredictable ways. Despite the extreme conditions, Antarctica is home to vibrant wildlife, including penguins, seals, whales, and seabirds. The ice sheet provides essential habitats and breeding areas, protecting many species from predators and ensuring access to food. However, Edgar Cayce predicted a dramatic transformation. Antarctica would lose its ice cover and turn into a vast green expanse, perfect for agriculture. On the other hand, Cayce foresaw a less favorable fate for Australia. He predicted that floods would cover a quarter of Australia's territory, submerging cities like Adelaide. Ironically, the arid deserts like Simpson and Gibson would transform into fertile agricultural lands. New Zealand, however, would emerge unscathed and might even expand, connecting to Australia and becoming a refuge for those displaced by global convulsions. In Europe, the predictions were equally dramatic. Cayce predicted that much of northern Europe, including Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, would submerge, leaving only a fragmented archipelago of islands. The United Kingdom would also suffer, with vast areas from Scotland to the English Channel succumbing to rising sea levels. Although some highland areas, such as London and Birmingham, might remain intact, many regions would not escape the devastating changes. Ireland would be almost entirely swallowed by the ocean, leaving only the highest peaks above the waterline. For ocean enthusiasts, Cayce almost predicted an expansion of the terrestrial waters. A new sea would emerge from the merging of the Black and Baltic Seas, cutting Russia off from continental Europe and extending into Siberia. This would position Russia as Europe's granary, a fertile agricultural power, the root cause of all calamity. For Cayce, the catastrophe he described was not easily boxed into a single cause. Instead, he presented a compound explanation in which natural forces and human agency could act together to produce devastation on an unprecedented scale. Some passages read like straightforward geological warning, earthquakes, fault rupture, and massive land shifts, while others carry darker overtones that point to human violence, explosions in the atmosphere, and sudden heat rising from the earth. Interpreters of Cayce divide along two principal lines. One camp treats his references to explosions and heat as metaphors for volcanic activity or internal tectonic processes, reading his words as dramatic but essentially naturalistic predictions. The other camp reads those same images as veiled references to modern warfare, to weapons and phenomena that, while not named in the vocabulary of his era, suggest detonations so powerful they could disturb the planet's crust. The question is not trivial. If human technologies can indeed trigger or amplify geological events, then the moral responsibility for resulting damage shifts from fate to human hands. Cayce adds a third, foundational layer to this debate by insisting on a spiritual dimension. Calamity, in his vision, follows moral decline. He frames California as more than a region of geography. It is a moral center where pride, greed, and the cult of fame concentrated in ways that, in his view, made the land spiritually vulnerable. For Cayce, natural catastrophes are rarely neutral. They are, at least in part, responses to human choices, a sickness of civilization that manifests physically. This theological reading turns the question of cause into a summons. To change human behavior is to alter the likelihood and character of future disasters. This threefold model: natural processes, human-initiated violence, and spiritual consequence, has practical implications. If earthquakes and tsunamis are purely geological, mitigation focuses on engineering and early warning. If human-made detonations can ripple into tectonic systems, then arms control and the political choices of nations become central to prevention. If spiritual imbalance plays a causal role, then communal ethics, cultural priorities, and the ways societies cultivate humility and mutual care become part of disaster risk reduction. Cayce's synthesis forces planners and citizens to think across disciplines: geology, geopolitics, and ethics. He described the causes as intertwined, and he emphasized that human agency, especially moral choices made collectively, could either exacerbate or alleviate the risk. Pride, he taught, concentrates energy inward and upward towards self-interest. Humility disperses that concentration and refocuses communities on care. In his framework, preventing catastrophe is not merely technical work, it is cultural and spiritual labor that reshapes how people live together, use power, and steward the earth. Cayce's worry about California aligns with well-established scientific concerns. The state sits on complex, active fault systems and faces real exposure to seismic hazard and coastal change. But where science describes probabilities and timelines, Cayce described thresholds and moral meaning. Cayce's warning is therefore not just a prediction, it is an ethical diagnosis that insists on responsibility. Earth changes. In the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, Cayce made many prophecies of cataclysmic events involving the whole planet, with a series of Earth changes occurring very soon. He predicted that the polar axis would shift, and that many areas that are now land would again become ocean floor, and that Atlantis would rise from the sea. The phrase, Earth changes, was coined by the American psychic Edgar Cayce in the 1930 seconds in reference to his belief that the world would soon enter a series of cataclysmic events, causing major alterations in human life on, quote, the planet. This includes natural events, such as major earthquakes, the melting of the polar ice caps, a pole shift of the planetary axis, major weather events, solar flares, and so on, as well as huge changes in the local and global social, economic, and political systems. Cayce's term was taken up in certain segments of the New Age movement, often associated with other predictions by people claiming to have psychic abilities. These beliefs have occasionally been associated with Christian millennialism and beliefs about UFOs. Some New Age adherents believe that Earth's changes will preface a golden age of spirituality and world peace. According to him, all of these will happen very soon, maybe in 2026. The karma of the soul. Cayce could read people's lives, whether he had ever met them or not. They could be complete strangers from anywhere in the world. All he needed was their full name, date of birth, and place of birth, and he could describe their surroundings, personality, strengths, weaknesses, and even details about their past lives and future paths with stunning accuracy. While exploring his own life through these readings, Cayce discovered that hundreds of years ago, during a past life in ancient Egypt, he had been a high priest with powerful supernatural abilities. But his arrogance and obsession with earthly pleasures led to his downfall. He believed that the virtues and flaws he carried in this life were directly linked to that past existence, and that his current life was a kind of spiritual test, giving his soul a chance to serve others selflessly and make up for his pride, indulgence, and mistakes of the past. Many of Cayce's past life readings supported the ancient idea of karma and reincarnation, similar to the teachings found in traditional Eastern philosophy. Despite performing thousands of these readings, Cayce never claimed to have any special powers. He once said, "I'm just one of the few who can completely step aside from my own personality. That allows my soul to tap into a kind of universal knowledge. I'm not saying this to boast. I honestly don't believe I have abilities that others don't. The truth is, every human being has far greater potential than they realize. But to access it, you have to let go of selfish desires. Lifespan as human beings will be extended. We know that humans are now living longer than at the time of Edgar Cayce, but his readings seem to indicate that a healthy human lifespan would extend years beyond that which we are currently living. He once said, "Now we find there are many changes in the body since we have had this, many for good. Many of the organs and the conditions show the changes as come about by the natural, or so-called natural, conditions, in changes as the body succumbs to the effects of age or usage in the system. Much of this may be overcome. Man should live much longer than has been ordinarily given, and will." While we have seen improvements in healthcare that have increased lifespans compared to Cayce's time, living for centuries remains a drastic idea. It would mean not just adding years to life, but also maintaining good health over extended periods. Cayce's vision implies that future generations might enjoy a longer and better quality of life in their later years. This could lead to changes in how societies are structured, including retirement ages and healthcare systems. The idea challenges us to think about aging not as a process of decline, but as an opportunity for continued growth and contribution to society. While Cayce's specific time frame and ways for achieving these longer lifespans remain uncertain and speculative, his vision encourages us to consider the possibilities of future medical advancements and their potential impact on human longevity. It makes us imagine a future where aging is viewed differently, with new opportunities and challenges for individuals and society as a whole. Meanwhile, Baba Vanga gave the other prediction about human life. Baba Vanga is believed to have predicted that from 2026, human babies will be born in laboratories, where the color of their skin to their character can be decided. This means that the entire process of birth will be controlled. The rise of technology, according to Vanga, advancements in reproductive technology have already made it possible for some couples to conceive through in vitro fertilization, IVF, and other assisted reproductive technologies. However, the idea of human reproduction becoming entirely artificial raises a number of ethical questions, such as whether it is right to create human life in a laboratory setting. Additionally, it is unclear what impact this could have on the population as a whole and what unintended consequences could arise from such technology. Human reproduction, becoming entirely artificial, could have significant consequences for our population and society. It could potentially lead to a decrease in genetic diversity and a greater reliance on technology to create new life. It could also raise significant ethical questions about the creation and ownership of life, as well as the role of government and society in regulating and controlling such technology. The development of artificial reproductive technologies is an active area of research, and significant advancements have already been made in this field. For example, scientists have successfully grown mouse embryos in an artificial womb, and human embryos have been successfully grown in vitro. While there are still many technical and ethical challenges to be addressed, these advancements suggest that the development of entirely artificial human reproduction is not outside the realm of possibility. The development of artificial body parts and prosthetics is an active area of research, and significant advancements have already been made in this field. For example, scientists have developed brain-controlled prosthetic arms, and some artificial organs, such as hearts, are already in use. While the development of entirely artificial bodies and organs is still a long way off, these advancements suggest that the potential for such technology is not out of the question. The Second Coming. Edgar Cayce's predictions about the Second Coming of Christ are among his most intriguing and controversial. Cayce, a devout Christian, believed that the return of Christ would be a pivotal event in human history, marking the end of an age of materialism and the beginning of a new era of spiritual awakening. Cayce suggested that the Second Coming would occur sometime soon. He did not give a specific date, but indicated that it would happen during a period of great global upheaval and change. According to Cayce, the period preceding the Second Coming would be marked by widespread chaos, conflict, and natural disasters. He predicted wars, economic collapse, and social unrest on a global scale, as well as an increase in earthquakes, hurricanes, and other catastrophic events. Cayce believed that the global turmoil would serve as a catalyst for a profound spiritual awakening. He predicted that people would turn away from materialism and seek a deeper connection with the divine, leading to a renewed interest in spirituality and a desire for inner peace. Cayce's visions of the Second Coming described Christ returning not as a physical being, but as a spiritual presence that would manifest in the hearts and minds of people all over the world. He believed that this presence would guide humanity toward a new era of love, compassion, and unity. Cayce predicted that the Second Coming would lead to the establishment of a new world order based on spiritual principles. He envisioned a global society founded on cooperation, equality, and the recognition of the interconnectedness of all life. Cayce emphasized the importance of individual spiritual growth and transformation in preparing for the Second Coming. He believed that each person had a role to play in ushering in the new era, and that personal spiritual development was essential to the collective awakening of humanity. The predictions fulfilled. Unlike other prophets of his time, his predictions covered a wide range of topics, from health and wellness to spirituality, past lives, ancient civilizations, and future technologies. The feats of the sleeping prophet were limitless. In 1902, a young woman with a severe head injury was brought to him. While doctors believed she would not survive, he nearly diagnosed that the real problem was in the spine, not the brain, and suggested that doctors adjust her spine. He read the human body like an X-ray machine, using medical terms with surprising accuracy. In a few months, the young woman showed great improvement. Edgar also used his gifts for the good of the economy. In 1929, foreseeing the imminent stock market crash, he warned his friends to sell their shares. Those who followed his advice managed to save large sums of money. People frequently asked Edgar about who would win a horse race or what would happen in the stock market, and he often responded, bringing profits to those who followed his advice. In one of those predictions, he was correct in saying that the economy would improve until 1930. In 1934, he predicted that Hitler would become an influential leader in Germany, which happened that same year. He also predicted that Hitler's rule would not last and that a war coming from outside Germany would end his empire. He anticipated the outbreak of a significant war in the heart of Europe, and Germany started World War II, which led to the end of Hitler's reign. He was right in predicting that Germany, Austria, and Japan would form an alliance. Edgar also spoke about the existence of ruins of an ancient civilization under the ocean, near Bimini, in the Bahamas. In 1938, he suggested that this city was the legendary Atlantis, a super-advanced civilization. Curiously, in 1968, underwater structures were found in Bimini, which some researchers believe support Edgar's prophecies. He described Atlantis as a vast continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, with technology more advanced than ours, but which disappeared under the ocean about 10,000 years ago due to a great flood. Could this flood be the same one recorded in the Bible during the days of Noah? One of Edgar's most famous predictions was about the 44th president of the United States. He said that this president would be African American, which came true with the election of Barack Obama. Edgar also predicted the deaths of Presidents John Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt and anticipated civil and racial rights issues that would lead to social unrest in the United States during the 1960 seconds. Additionally, he was aware of the realities of the Cold War, predicting many of the challenges and tensions of the time. At the height of the Soviet Union's power, Edgar made a surprising statement. The hope of the world would come from Russia, not through communism, but through freedom. He claimed that this hope would take time, but that Russia would eventually free itself from communism, which came true with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Another impressive example involves the Jewish sect of the Essenes. In 1934, when little was known about them, Edgar provided detailed descriptions that were later proven accurate. He even predicted the discovery of their records and documents, which was confirmed only 12 years later with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. All these impressive predictions of Edgar were fulfilled in the 20th century, and he also made some grim predictions for our times. Despite the skepticism, Cayce still has fervent defenders who highlight the accuracy of some of his diagnoses and advice to sick individuals, even without medical training. These controversies and debates about his predictions keep the curiosity and fascination for his figure alive to this day. Edgar Cayce's enduring legacy, fueled by widespread interest in psychic phenomena, continues to intrigue many. A recent survey revealed that many believe in some form of extrasensory perception or psychic ability. It also highlighted the difference between believers and skeptics. While skeptics tend to be more analytical and critical, believers generally have a more emotional and creative mindset. Interestingly, those who believe in psychic abilities reported experiencing greater happiness and lower levels of stress than skeptics. The enigma of psychic abilities and religious miracles has always fascinated humanity, especially because they challenge traditional scientific explanations. It is undeniable that such experiences can bring comfort to those who suffer, hope to those facing difficulties, and a sense of order in an often chaotic world. Although there is debate about the authenticity of his psychic abilities, Cayce's legacy reminds us that, regardless of our personal beliefs about the paranormal, compassion and altruism have a profound and real impact. An interesting curiosity is why Edgar Cayce was called the Sleeping Prophet. This nickname arose because Cayce made his predictions and readings while appearing to be asleep, or rather, in a trance state. He would lie down, close his eyes, and still manage to speak about incredible things that seemed to come from another dimension. Now, think about the possibility of accessing parts of our minds that we normally don't use. Edgar Cayce showed that perhaps we all have a hidden ability to attain profound knowledge simply by changing the way we use our minds. If we learn to do this as Cayce did, imagine how many mysterious and interesting things we might discover about the world and ourselves. This makes us reflect on the incredible power that resides within each of us, waiting to be explored. Viewed against today's landscape of intense political conflict, religious polarization, and a broad hunger for meaning, the prospect that 2026 could function as such a litmus year feels urgent. With influential figures continuing to command vast followings, Cayce's warning invites us to examine whether public devotion is informed by conscience and humility, or by fear, tribal identity, and untested claims. The crisis he foresaw would make choices visible: whom we trust, what we demand of our leaders, and how willing we are to prioritize truth over expedience. And if you have these signs, might be you are experiencing a spiritual awakening. One of the first signs of spiritual awakening is heightened intuition. Intuition is often described as an inner knowing, a subtle voice or feeling that guides us without conscious reasoning. Imagine moments when you suddenly just know the right path to take, or when you understand something without needing to analyze it. These instances become more frequent and pronounced. You might make decisions based on a feeling or a hunch, which often are remarkably accurate and beneficial. This heightened intuition keeps you in tune with your inner voice, which speaks from your true self, free from overthinking and external influences. The noise of everyday life dims, allowing you to hear the wisdom inside you all along. As you experience this shift, your intuition becomes a source of creativity and inspiration. You may discover new solutions to problems, or feel inspired to take paths you hadn't considered before. Trusting this inner guidance can be empowering, leading to a deeper understanding of yourself and your purpose. Increased empathy and compassion is the second sign. You may gain a deeper empathy and compassion as you journey through a spiritual awakening. Suddenly, the boundaries between your emotions and those of others might seem blurred, allowing you to feel what they feel with a heightened sense of understanding and sensitivity. You might genuinely experience the ebbs and flows of emotions that others are going through. This increased empathy can extend to all living beings, people, animals, and the environment. You become more at one with the subtle expressions of nature and the silent voices of animals, sensing their unspoken stories and needs. Alongside empathy, your compassion also grows. This might manifest in small acts of kindness, like offering a listening ear to a friend or helping a stranger in need. Or it could inspire more significant changes in your life, such as volunteering for causes you care about or making lifestyle choices that are more considerate of the planet and its population. This increase in empathy and compassion is a sign of your heart opening and your consciousness expanding. You start to see the interconnectedness of all life, recognizing that the well-being of others directly impacts your own. As enriching as this heightened empathy and compassion can be, looking after yourself is important. Being deeply attuned to the emotions of others can feel overwhelming at times. Setting healthy emotional boundaries helps you maintain your emotional well-being. The next sign that you need to focus on is desire for meaningful connections. A key aspect of experiencing a spiritual awakening is the desire for deeper, more meaningful connections in your life. This shift often begins as a growing dissatisfaction with superficial interactions and a hunger for relationships that offer genuine depth and authenticity. You may find yourself longing for conversations beyond the mundane, seeking to connect on a level that nourishes your soul and aligns with your newfound understanding of the world. As you embark on this journey, the nature of your relationships may begin to change. You might gravitate towards people who share your values and perspectives, or challenge you to grow and think in new ways. You might seek out those who understand and respect your journey in your friendships, offering support and wisdom. In romantic relationships, you may desire a partner who supports and participates in your spiritual growth. Even in professional settings, you might find yourself drawn to work that feels more aligned with your values and allows for authentic expression. This shift can also mean letting go of relationships that no longer serve your growth. Recognizing that some connections might hinder your journey is an essential part of this process. It's about finding balance and ensuring that your social circle reflects and supports your spiritual path. Changing priorities is also a special sign. During a spiritual awakening, one of the most noticeable changes is your priorities and values. You might find yourself reassessing what truly matters to you, leading to a significant shift in how you view and interact with the world. You'll begin to value personal growth, meaningful relationships, and enriching experiences over material possessions. This realization can be liberating, freeing you from pursuing material gains and allowing you to focus on what genuinely enriches your life. As personal growth climbs higher on your list of priorities, you might invest more time and energy in activities that nurture your mind, body, and spirit. This could include meditation, yoga, reading, or creative hobbies. The joy in these activities often comes from the inner peace and self-discovery they bring. Relationships also take on a new significance.